The assistant chief of the Capitol Police's uniformed operations was forced to resign Tuesday morning, shortly before the Senate's Capitol attack report was released. Chad Thomas was the number 2 at the Capitol Police and a 25-year veteran on the force. Thomas was involved in the agency's planning for January 6th. CBS News reporter Cassidy McDonald has been covering all angles of the Capitol riot investigation and joins me now. Cassidy, help us understand why the assistant chief of the Capitol Police was forced to resign, and what does that tell us about how the agency is changing?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, the news that Chad Thomas was leaving the Capitol Police, it came just ahead of the Senate report that was released today. And it also came after a series of Inspector General reports continued to point out issues related to intelligence and planning ahead of the January 6th attack. Now, my colleagues have reported that Thomas was responsible for much of the Capitol Police planning ahead of January 6th. So the Inspector General has told Capitol Police, has recommended that they go through a fundamental cultural shift and move away from being in a posture like a traditional police force, one that's reactive and responds to crimes that have already been committed, and move towards the posture of more of a protective agency. The IG points to the Secret Service as an example of an agency with some of the best practices in that area. So planning and intelligence sharing ahead of the attack, those are things that continue to come up in report after report. And I expect that there'll be a continued focus as the Capitol Police look to reform after what happened January 6th.
Well, it has been just over 5 months since January 6th. Are Capitol Police officers still dealing with the fallout from that day? And if so, how?
Yes, they sure are. We're just over 150 days out from this attack. And Elaine, we reported last week that 17 officers were still out of work because of injuries they got trying to defend the Capitol January 6th. Now, in a powerful moment during a court hearing last week, my colleague Claire Himes reported that the court heard testimony from one of those officers who still has not fully returned to work after she says she suffered a brain injury January 6th. And she wrote in testimony that was read in court that she was still suffering symptoms like random fainting spells, psychological and physical trauma, and all of that was making it impossible for her to return to work, and a job, by the way, that she says she loves. She wrote in her testimony, "When will I be free and full again?" And Elaine, I have to mention, the Capitol Police Union has said that over 70, more than 70 officers have resigned or retired after January 6th. And so the union has said that they're concerned about keeping officers in the job.
So you mentioned that one officer and the nature of her injuries. Do we know those other officers that you mentioned? What is the nature of their injuries that they've sustained, requiring them to still only be back in a partial capacity, it sounds like?
Well, we don't have a full breakdown of the injuries that are specifically keeping officers from returning to work. But what we do know is that officers facing violence that day, they experienced injuries like cracked ribs, smashed spinal discs, cuts to the face, eyes and skin burned from chemical spray. And in addition to those many physical injuries, we know that many officers are still experiencing psychological injuries and psychological trauma. Officer Michael Fanone wrote in a letter last month that as his physical injuries subsided, in crept the psychological trauma. And Fanone is one of the few officers who's been extremely public about his experience. He said that during the riot that day, he was pulled alone into the crowd, beaten with fists and metal objects, tased multiple times, he says. And he says that he heard some in the crowd yelling, "Kill him with his own gun." And so while he's one of the few officers who's been open about the way that this has continued to weigh heavily on him, he's one of many who were assaulted under similar circumstances that day, and he's one of many, as we report, still managing injuries from that day.
So where does the criminal investigation stand at this point? Is there more to come?
Well, so far, around 465 defendants have been arrested. The Department of Justice recently pointed out that that works out to an average of about 3 arrests every single day, including weekends, since January 6th. And I don't expect those arrests to stop anytime soon because we know that the FBI is still looking for more than 250 people who are suspected of assaults on officers and other violent acts at the Capitol that day. And so another benchmark also, in addition, in these large number of arrests that we've reached recently, so far, at least 50 people who have been arrested are either current or former military service members. That's according to court documents reviewed by my colleague, Ellie Watson. And Elaine, those include at least one current active duty Marine, 4 current part-time service members, and veterans from across multiple different military branches.
All right, Cassidy McDonald keeping track of all of that for us. Thanks very much, Cassidy, for the update.
Thank you.